Hi class, I just finished recording lesson 10.2. We're going to move on to lesson 10.3 now, solving quadratic equations. After this lesson, I want you to be able to solve these equations by graphing and by using square roots. We're going to do a little review of square roots, which was back from lesson 3.9 in your textbook, just in case you don't remember the ins and outs of solving a square. So we can also undo a square like x squared by taking the square root of both sides. If I gave you x squared and I wanted you to isolate your x, you would have to take the square root of both sides to solve for it. But what you need to remember is there are two solutions for this. The square root of x squared is x, but the square root of 64 is positive 8 and negative 8, because both of those numbers multiplied by themselves give you a positive 64. Let's try a little more difficult problem. If I gave you 2x squared minus 98 equals 0, you would have to use your inverse order of operations to solve for x. So we're going to add 98 to both sides. You're going to get 2x squared equals 98. Divide both sides by 2, and you get x squared equals 49. Thankfully, it's a perfect square. Take the square root of both sides, and you get x equals positive or negative 7. Now would be a good time for you to pause and see if you can figure out these problems on your own. Whether you paused or not, we're back, and we're going to solve these problems together. On the first problem, we're going to add 25 to both sides because we have to use the reverse order of operations. We're going to get x squared equals 25. We now need to take the square root of both sides. We're going to end up with x equals positive or negative 5. There are two solutions to that problem. Next problem, we're going to subtract 12 from both sides. We get 3n squared equals 0. Now we're going to divide both sides by 0. We know 0 divided by any number is 0. And so when we take the square root of both sides, we get n is 0. There is no such thing as a positive or negative 0. So there's only one solution to this problem. And then finally, the last one. We're going to subtract 32 from both sides. We get 2r squared equals negative 32. And now we're going to have to take and divide both sides by 2. We get r squared equals negative 16. I know this can't be right. I'm hoping that you know this can't be right, because we cannot get a negative number for a square. So when we take the square root of both sides, we get the square root of r squared is r, but there's no solution because no number multiplied by itself is going to give us a negative number. Now let's use this information in a little bit to solve quadratic equations. We're going to start out pretty basic. I gave you x squared plus 3x minus 4 equals 0. This is the same equation that we've been using, y equals x squared plus 3x minus 4. The only difference is I substituted 0 for y. Why did I do that? Well, this equation is only asking for a solution when y is 0. So this is going to help us figure out what x is. Because we know what y is 0. What is x when y is 0? When y is 0, we're finding our, good job, our x-intercept. So let's look at one. If I gave you x squared minus 9 equals 0, and I substituted y for 0 and got x squared minus 9, you should be able to graph this inequality. You know the opposite of b over 2a is your vertex. You also should be able to find your y-intercept, and finally you can find your axis of symmetry. This is what your parabola should look like. Where does y equal 0? Well, look. Y equals 0 here. Right? No. Y equals 0 here. So let's draw a line across there. Right here and right here are your two solutions. And if you had solved this by backing out until you got x by itself, you would have gotten these 2 points as your solution, 3 and negative 3, because we would have added 9 to both sides and then taken the square root of x squared and 9 and gotten negative 3 and 3. There are the solutions to x squared minus 9 equals 0, and there are 2 of them. Now I want to give you a little bit of information before we move on. If I gave you 2x squared equals 0 and I graphed it, it would look like this. I would only have one solution. It's 0. If I solve this problem and graphed it, I would get No x-intercept because this parabola does not intersect with the x-axis. So it would be no solution. And then finally, the last one, there are going to be two solutions because it intercepts with the x-axis in two places, at 1 and -1. So the number of solutions that you're going to get when you solve a quadratic equation are either 0, no solution, or 2 solutions. Let's try another problem. This would be a good time for you to pause and see if you can figure this out. X squared minus 1. I'm going to add 1 to both sides. I'm going to get positive and -1 as my solution. 2 intercepts right here. This one I'm going to subtract 4. I know when I subtract 4, I end up with a negative number on the right side. So if I take the square root, I'm going to end up with no solution. It does not intercept the x-axis at all. No solution. And then finally, this one, I'm going to add 16. I'm going to get 0. Well, the square root of 0 is always 0. And so it's going to intercept the x-axis at 0. Let's try a few more. See if you can do these 3. The first one, you should have gotten 2 intercepts, -3 and 3. Good job. The next one, here I've got to subtract 9, so I'm going to end up with a negative number on the right side, and I know that I can't get a solution when I'm trying to take the square root of a negative number. So it does not intercept the x-axis. And then finally, when I have 0 over here, I know that it's going to intersect the y or x-axis at 0. So it intercepts right here. Let's try a word problem. Find the side of a square with an area of 90 feet. Well, if I know the area is 90 feet squared, that meant I took x times x. To find one side, I have to take the square root of it. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. When I take the square root of x, I get x. What do I get when I take the square root of 90? Because it's not a perfect square. I get x equals 9.49 feet. Some of you may be asking, isn't it positive or negative 9.49 feet? Not in this case. You cannot get a negative distance. So it's always going to be positive when you're talking distance. Let's try one more problem. Some of you may recognize Miss Larson right here in this picture. She wants you to find the dimensions for the square picture that would make the area of the picture equal to 90% of the total area enclosed by the frame. Let's try that again. Find the dimensions for the square picture. That's just the picture that would make the area of the picture equal to 90% of this total frame. So we're going to use x squared equals 90% of the area of the total. And so the frame is the gray area right here. So 11 squared is going to be 121. 90% of that is 108 and 9/10. Take the square root of both sides. We get x equals 9 and 49/100 inches. I hope this made sense to you. If you have any questions, come back and talk to Mr. Harrer or myself in class tomorrow. Have a great day.